just a thing, a cliche to say. I really am, because whenever you do doctoral work to get a PhD, you always have to specialize in something. And everyone knows that when you specialize in one topic and you go to teach at anything else except an advanced research institution, you rarely get to teach your topic. In my classes that I'm teaching this semester, I'm teaching an Old Testament class. I think maybe one day out of the semester we'll actually talk about something that I really research. Everything else you just need to learn about. And that's the great thing of being a teacher, is you get to be a constant learner. And that's the great thing about this program, is it lets you all continue to be learners. So when Rabbi Spitzer invited me to talk about Josephus, I was leaping for joy, because that's what I have studied. That's one of my main topics. Before we even get into that topic, what am I interested in? And how does this relate to what we're talking about tonight? I'm interested in the history of imperialism, the history of empires, and how they've impacted peoples throughout history, as well as impacted religion. So I'm interested in ancient religion and the impact that imperial power has on it. And when Rabbi Spitzer said I study the Second Temple period of Judaism, that means from the year 538 or 539 BC, which is when an emperor, the Persian king Cyrus, who just conquered all of the Near East and turned it into his empire, granted permission to the Jews who had been deported to what is now modern-day Iraq. He gave them permission to return to Palestine and rebuild their temple and ultimately their society. So it was an act of imperial government that, in a sense, enabled Judaism, as we now know it, to come into existence and to flourish. And throughout the remaining centuries before the Common Era, Jews had constantly to reckon with the fact that they were not an independent, politically independent nation, but they were basically a province of someone else's empire, whether it was the Persians, or the Greeks, or later the Romans. They were always part of someone else's umbrella. And in fact, there's an Old Testament text that deals with this explicitly. It's called the Book of Daniel. And in the Book of Daniel, it maps out human history as a history of empire. And it speaks of the negative impact, the negative experience of often brutal rule by a foreign power over the people of Israel, and how this sequence of empires will ultimately end with what is called the kingdom of the holy ones of the Most High. That is to say, God will reinstitute a kind of national independence for the Jews that will be the sign of his ultimate power over history. So a lot of Jewish writings of this kind think about this problem of empire and imperial power, and the fact that we're under it rather than independent of it. So then how does that connect with our topic for tonight? Josephus. Who was Josephus? Well, let's talk about the topic of Rabbi Spitzer's course, Rome and Jerusalem, the clash of civilizations. So from the 1st century BCE, I'll use the BCE-CE reckoning for tonight, 1st century BCE through the 1st century CE, the Jews of Palestine, but also the Jews throughout the Mediterranean, experienced Roman rule. And during the 1st century CE, the year 70, something very consequential happened. Something consequential not only for future Jewish history, but also, I would argue, for Christianity. And that was the destruction by the Romans, by Roman legions, who were at war with the Jews of Palestine at this time, the destruction by Roman legions of the Jerusalem temple, Mount Zion. The temple, the focus of Jewish piety and worship, an irreplaceable place where you went to encounter God, was decimated, was destroyed. It hadn't been the first time, because of course, back at the beginning of this period, again, the Persian king gave the Jews permission to go and rebuild the temple because someone else had destroyed it before them. So the Jews did not react to this event as something wholly alien to their experience. They had models in the scriptures and in other non-biblical writings for confronting and dealing with tragedy like this. But this was not to be, as it turned out in retrospect, a temporary circumstance. As we know, the temple has not been rebuilt, it has not been restored. And so you have a permanent condition which came upon the Jewish people at this time, in the year 70. And obviously that has shaped, and in many ways given birth to Rabbinic Judaism, the form of Judaism that we have today, which is essentially the rabbis trying to figure out how to live fully the life of the Torah, the life of God's instruction for us without a temple, which was integral to Jewish worship and Jewish practice at that time. How do you live without a temple? Now, so it's consequential for Jewish history. It's also consequential for Christian history. What was the most important event in the first century CE or AD for Christians? Most people, if I was to ask you, what was the most important event in the first century CE or AD for Christians, what would people answer? What would you say is the most important event for Christians? Sorry, the birth of what? Of what, sorry? Yeah. The most important event for a Christian would say of the first century is the death and resurrection of Christ, and maybe the birth of Christ too. No question about that. But if I was to speak as a historian, I was to ask the question, what event, other than the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, impacted Christian consciousness and impacted the way Christians thought about Jesus? What was the most important event in the first century? It's the same event. It's the destruction of the temple in the year 70 by the Romans. Why? Well, because Christians at this time were mostly Jews. And the temple was for them one of the most important concepts and lenses that they used to interpret the significance of Jesus. There's actually a famous passage in the book of Acts where the disciples of Jesus encounter Jesus raised from the dead, the risen Lord, the risen Messiah, and he's about to ascend into heaven to begin exercising his role as Messiah. And just before he leaves, they ask him a question. Lord, will you at this time restore sovereignty to Israel? Will you at this time restore sovereignty, literally the kingdom of God, to Israel? Which is exactly the question any Jew would ask of a Messiah. The role of the Messiah is to restore, or at least to give witness to the fact that Israel has been restored as an independent nation under God. Are you going to do this? Isn't that what the Messiah does? The answer Jesus gives them is, you don't know when this will happen. But he doesn't say no. So the assumption of the earliest Christians was that this is what the Messiah does. He will restore Jerusalem and all of Palestine to a homeland, an independent homeland for the Jews. That's the assumption, and Jesus doesn't say no. He just says, it's not yet. So even the Christians thought that this notion of the Jews living free of empire in their land was significant. And so naturally, when the temple was destroyed, Christians, this was a question. What do we do with this? How do we understand this cataclysmic event for our understanding of who we are? That's another talk. That's not part of today's talk. But as an introduction, how then can we even begin to grapple with the catastrophe of the year 70? We wouldn't be able to do it without the writings of Josephus. So now we come to today's talk. Why is Josephus so important? We couldn't have the course that Rabbi Spitzer is teaching without Josephus. He is the only author, the only writer that has survived as a contemporary witness to several hundred years of Jewish history, which without him, we would only have scraps, bits and pieces in a vast sea of emptiness. We wouldn't be able to write a history, a connected history of Judaism from the time that the temple is restored in the 6th century BC through the time of Jesus and the destruction of the temple, again in the year 70, without Josephus. We simply couldn't do it. We would have rabbinic traditions, but to try to spring them together in a connected narrative, we couldn't do it without Josephus. So he's one of the two most prolific Jewish writers from the 1st century CE. And he is our sole, in many cases, our sole witness to Jewish history for this period. So it's hard to underestimate his importance for a course like this. The Clash of Civilizations, the subtitle for this course, the premise, or at least the need to explain how the catastrophe of 70 came about, and also what were its long-term impacts on Judaism, on anti-Semitism. You can't do it without Josephus. Josephus is, in fact, the first Jewish response to that catastrophe, and he wrote his writings as a kind of defense of his people, of their character, of their history, and of their hopes for their future, in a situation where the world was, as a consequence of this catastrophe, was beginning to form very negative images of the Jews. He was writing a defense of Jews and Judaism. Okay, so here we have the first, in a sense, rebuttal to anti-Semitism. Not that elements of that didn't exist perhaps before the year 70, but it's the year 70 that really is a turning point in that history too. So we can't do any of this without Josephus. So what I want to do tonight is begin by giving a brief biography of Josephus. Who was he and what happened to him in his lifetime that gave him the ability to write what he wrote. And then we'll talk a bit about his writings. The handout I gave gives you a sort of a timeline for Josephus' life, and then gives a synopsis of his writings. And I will talk a bit about each of them. So who was Josephus? Josephus, of course, is a Latinized version of his name. Latinized meaning it's adapted to the Latin language. And the ending us, us, is a very common ending for masculine names in Latin. The Romans were Cornelius, Flavius, what are other ones? Claudius. So Josephus is a Latinized form of a Jewish name, Joseph, Yosef. Right? We all know the name Joseph from the Bible. A very common Jewish name at the time for Christians. You know, Joseph is the name of Jesus' father, in quotation marks. So Joseph, he's Joseph. Joseph, son of Matthias, son of Mattathias. He was a Jewish priest, a Jewish aristocrat, so he came from the upper classes, the literate classes. He was part of the ruling class of Judea in the 1st century A.D. He was a priest, and so he knew the religious traditions of his homeland, and could articulate and speak about them and communicate them to a non-Jewish audience very effectively. And he was a statesman. He was a statesman. He actually was involved in the governance of his nation for a time. So he was very well positioned to talk as a spokesperson. He wasn't the only spokesperson. In fact, we know that there were other Jewish elites who responded to the catastrophe of the year 70 and thought Josephus was a rather bad character, so he often got into fights over his own reputation with these other Jewish writers. But that's another story. Who was he? What was his family background? Well, again, he was a priest, so he was from the tribe of Levi, because the Levites were the priests, designated the genealogical group to be priests. He was more specifically of the descendants of Aaron, Moses' brother. Right? So he was a priest. He was actually related to a very famous family of Jewish priests from a couple centuries before, the Maccabees. The Maccabees. He was a descendant, like his great-great-grandmother, of the Maccabees. And as a shameless piece of self-promotion, we will in this program be having a short series on the Maccabees too. The Maccabees were heroes 2 centuries before the Common Era who had liberated for a very brief time Palestine from foreign rule and had established an independent Jewish state for about 100 years. They were the ones who were overturned. Their rule was overturned by the Romans. Ultimately, the Romans put another Jewish leader in their place, namely Herod the Great. So anyway, he was a descendant of the Maccabees. He was born in the year 37 CE, which was a rather tense time for the Jews of Palestine and indeed all over the empire. This was the reign of the Emperor Caligula, who was known for his antics and sometimes for his insanity. One example which was he tried to put a statue of himself in the Temple of God in Jerusalem and nearly provoked a widespread riot and a revolt over this, but fortunately he was assassinated before this could be implemented. This was the world that Josephus was born into. According to his own account of the history of Judea during the 1st century CE, he grew up in a time where there was a lot of bad Roman administrators, and often had very tense relationships between the Roman administrators and the Jewish aristocracy of which he was a part. But in his life, in his autobiography that he wrote for us, he says, actually, I was more interested in religion first. As a youth, I grew up, and when I was about 14 years old, I entered into a testing period where I tested out all of the different schools of thought of Judaism. And I found that I was better than all of them. He was not humble. In fact, he said, even before I engaged in this shopping for a school of philosophy, as he called it, he was so well versed in the Torah, in the Jewish law, that when he was a mere lad, all of the greatest scholars of the law came to him to hear his opinions. Now, if you're familiar with the Gospel of Luke, you know that that's a story about Jesus too. It's possible that Luke borrowed that story from Josephus. It's actually it's a general sort of stereotype for if you're telling a story about a great man, some great men too, but great men, always you tell a story about their youth, about how they were already they were sort of a wunderkind, they already showed their prospects for greatness as a child. So Josephus says, I was right up there at the forefront. The rabbis came to me to ask the question. Finally, I decided to test all the schools of Jewish thought, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and I found I was better than all of them. So, in fact, I had to go out into the wilderness, the Judean wilderness, the desert outside of Jerusalem, and for 3 years I endured a kind of ascetic life, like a monastic almost. He apprenticed himself to a Jewish holy man, and he lived out in the desert, sort of like John the Baptist in the Gospels, and he just really showed how tough and holy he was. Finally, after this period of a 3-year spiritual workout, he decided to return to his home city, Jerusalem, and enter public life. And in his biography, he says that when I entered into public life, as a public servant, as it were, I allowed myself to be governed by the rules of the sect of the Pharisees. Now, often in the past, people have said Josephus was actually a Pharisee by persuasion. And historians particularly were attracted to this premise because if that's true, then we actually have Josephus as the only Pharisee who actually wrote something that has been recorded. The problem with the Pharisees, important as they are for this period of Judaism, is that they never wrote anything, or at least if they did, they didn't say it was written by me, a Pharisee. In fact, the only person we really know who was a Pharisee who wrote anything was the Apostle Paul. And that's only as a, quote, ex-Pharisee, if you wish. So his testimony about Pharisees is kind of tainted. So it would be great if Josephus were a Pharisee, because then we could say his whole theology gives us evidence for what Pharisees really thought. The problem is that Josephus had nothing but a contempt for the Pharisees. For him, they were an underclass, sort of upstart group that wanted to lead Israel away from its true leadership, the priests, of which he was one. So he actually conformed himself to the rules of the Pharisees because he says if you want to be a successful politician, you have to follow what everyone expects you to do. And the masses, the mobs, always cater to the Pharisees. So you have to sort of go along with the program if you want to be elected to office. That's not unusual for politics, is it? Right? Anyway, Josephus enters public life. He says at one point, I actually led a diplomatic mission to Rome, the capital of the empire, and actually engaged in negotiations with the Roman emperor at the time, named Nero. And actually, through the influence of Nero's wife, I managed to free from a charge, a legal charge, some of my fellow priests, whom the governor of Judea had unceremoniously sent to Rome on a trumped-up charge. So I was a successful diplomat. Then he says, when I got back, in approximately the year 64 perhaps, he says, things were incredibly strained. Relations between the local Roman administration and us, the natural leaders of the people, were very strained. And actually, you know from his history of this period, he says that in the year 66, and in the timeline they give you, there's a shaded section. And this is the period of what's called the First Revolt, or the Great Revolt, or the Judean Revolt, or the Jewish War against Rome. This is what caused Rome to turn hostile against the Jews of Palestine and ultimately to destroy the temple. They revolted against Roman rule in the year 66 CE. Josephus narrates this. However, his testimony is suspicious at several points. The reason why is because Josephus, according to his own account, was one of the leaders of this revolt. He was part of the aristocratic faction that tried to control and lead and organize this revolt against Rome. Now, he himself would be later captured and imprisoned by the Romans, and he would eventually be released on the condition that he collaborate with the Romans to suppress this rebellion. And ultimately, after it was over, he was brought to Rome and given a pension and a house to live in and Roman citizenship. And so he was basically became a client of the new Roman emperor. So naturally, at that point, he had a motive for sort of explaining away his involvement, saying, well, I really didn't want to do it. The nobles, the Judean nobles, really didn't want this. They did their best to control it, but ultimately it was the rabble that overcame us and forced the nation into war. So he writes retrospectively to sort of exculpate himself and blame others. But nevertheless, he does give a very detailed account of how this revolt started. And, well, why did it start, according to him? You had a very bad Roman governor, according to him, who basically attempted to plunder the Jerusalem temple. Remember that, and temples in the ancient world were also banks. It's where you kept sacred money, sacred deposits, usually for use for the upkeep of the institution of the temple, the place of worship. According to Josephus, without any legitimate cause, the Roman governor attempted to extract certain funds from the temple. And he did so without the consent of the leaders, the temple leaders, for whom this money belongs to God. So there was resistance. There was Jewish resistance, and there was nonviolent resistance. The Roman governor responded by massacring hundreds, if not thousands, of Jews. It's hard to tell whether to trust numbers in any ancient historian. Numbers are always dangerous in terms of their accuracy. Authors like to exaggerate things. But anyway, he says lots of people died as a result of this brutal repression. And as a consequence, though, many leaders in the temple closed the temple against the Roman governor, and he couldn't enter it. And so he eventually left the city. The Jewish king at the time, Agrippa, who was a grandson, I believe, of Herod the Great, he attempted to calm passions, to say, let's not get into a situation that will cause us to lead into war with Rome. And apparently he was pelted by much of the audience, because the audience said, okay, send a delegation to Rome and complain. And he said he wouldn't. Right? So the closing ranks with the upper classes here against people whose family members had died and so on. Whatever the reason was, he refused to engage in a kind of negotiation process to resolve this dispute that had happened. And this provoked a reaction. It provoked a reaction from within the temple hierarchy. In fact, the son of the high priest, who was in charge really of the policing of the temple compound, the son of the high priest led a segment of the priesthood to make a declaration, to say that in the year 66, this is when this happened, said, we will refuse to accept gifts or offerings from foreigners, from non-Jews in this temple. Now, Josephus says this was the foundation of war. Why? Well, because one of the ways in which the Romans accommodated the Jews to their rule was to say, if you are good subjects of us, we will not require you to make a declaration of loyalty that involves sacrificing or burning incense to the emperor, right? Because the emperor is among the gods. This is the way you pledged allegiance in the Roman world. is you give offerings or some sort of sign of religious reverence to the emperor. Well, everyone knows Jews can't do that because they are commanded to worship their God alone. The Romans understood this, so they did not force this. They said, rather, at our expense, why don't you offer sacrifices to your God on behalf of the emperor, on behalf of his health, every day? And that would be a satisfactory symbol of loyalty, of compliance. Well, by the son of the high priest saying, we will allow no gifts from foreigners, who was he excluding there? Now, it's hard to get into the minds of these people because we only get the sort of the hostile or retrospective perspective of Josephus. So we don't actually know whether they were at the point of war at this point. It may have simply been, again, a protest, a nonviolent protest saying, Nero, if you want our continued compliance, then you'd better get a new governor, a governor who will respect the sanctity of the house of our God. Right? And if you do that, maybe we'll start this, offering sacrifices on your behalf again. That's one possible interpretation. Another is that this was simply a declaration of war. In any case, this was taken seriously, and indeed there was a military response to it. The Roman governor of Syria, which was sort of the overarching administrative source for the Eastern Mediterranean at this time, he came down there with a force to force his way into the temple, and for some reason he failed. He failed, and he was defeated in an engagement with the defenders of Jerusalem and was forced to flee. So the Jews knew that there would be Romans aplenty coming back after this initial victory, and so immediately the Jewish leaders, including Josephus, tried to organize the defense of the country. Josephus was one of them, and he was sent by sort of the new government. He was sent to Galilee, which is the northernmost part of Israel. He was sent there as a general to organize the defense of Galilee because that would be the first place that the Romans would hit. So in the year 66 and into the year 67, he went to Galilee to organize it as its general, and he did so. This is most of his biography has to do with his role as the general of Galilee. And when the Romans came, the Emperor Nero sent one of his best generals, Vespasian, to suppress the revolt. Josephus defended Galilee against Vespasian's forces. He endured a siege by Vespasian at a fortified hill town in Galilee called Josephus. And after a 20-day siege, actually I think it was more than 20 days, it was a long siege. Eventually the Romans broke in, slaughtered the defenders, and captured Josephus alive. Now back in 1992, I had the privilege of excavating Josephus. It was the beginning of a 10-year excavation of this very important site. And unfortunately, I couldn't get my pictures to scan of it, so I can't give you photos of it. If you go to Wikipedia, there's a nice shot of it. It's a marvelous site because it was never inhabited again after the Romans leveled it, which means that as soon as you start digging, other than a few Bedouin graves, you're there in the first century. You're there in the siege. My square was digging the side of the fortress that they had to shoot ballista balls into, and we found some of them. A couple seasons after I dug there, they actually found in one of the cisterns, the buried cisterns, they found the skeletons of the Jewish dead that the Romans had dumped in there. So it was the reality of the siege. It was very, very pointed. Anyway, Josephus was captured. He was imprisoned. And the suppression of the revolt continued. But Vespasian knew that in order to take Jerusalem down, you needed to capture all the territory around it. And I say all of Palestine, because you can't let any of the defenders of Jerusalem get supply lines from anywhere else. So it took them a good 3 years before they could actually close in on the mother city. And what made it more complicated for the Romans was that in the year 68, Nero committed suicide, which led to a power struggle, a civil war in Rome. This is the next year is called the Year of the Four Emperors. So warlord after warlord attempted to seize the capital and secure the provinces for his own supporters. 3 of them failed in very short order, and the 4th one succeeded, and that was none other than Vespasian himself, the general who was responsible for subjugating Judea. So in the year 69, at the end of the year 69 CE, Vespasian headed off to Rome to claim his rule of the empire. And while he was securing the empire, he sent his son, the general Titus, to finish the job in Jerusalem. And at that point, Josephus, who claims that he had actually prophesied that all this would happen, prophesied that Vespasian would win his way to the throne, so that Vespasian saw him as a useful propaganda device, and so he sent Josephus along with his son Titus to see to not the destruction, but the surrender, at least, or the destruction of the revolt. Josephus, of course, could speak Aramaic as well as Greek and some Latin, perhaps, so he could be a translator, right, for the Romans. He could go up before the walls of Jerusalem as close as he dared and try to persuade his countrymen to lay down their arms and sue for peace. And he nearly got himself killed doing that several times. Anyway, that last bloody year of the year 70, most of the books of his account detail in excruciating detail the fall of Jerusalem. According to him, it was an accident that the temple was destroyed. It was an accident, a stray torch by a Roman soldier. Titus really didn't want that to happen. That's possible. Or it could be that he's covering up. He doesn't want the Romans to look bad. He wants to assert that it's possible for there not to be a clash of civilizations here. It's possible to have peace with the conqueror. And whatever the truth, though, is that Jerusalem burned. The temple was razed to the ground, and it became a station for a Roman legion to make it clear that this would never become a threat again. This place would never become a threat again. After the devastation, Josephus was brought with Titus to Rome for his victory, for his triumph, which is what every victorious Roman general does. You go and you display your conquest to your own people, your own city. If you've ever been to Rome, or have seen pictures of it, you've probably seen the Arch of Titus, which is the monument Titus erected, glorifying his defeat of the Jews, glorifying his defeat of Jerusalem. It's from there that we get the first clear visual representation of the menorah, right? The object that was in the temple that the Romans spirited away as part of the plunder. Josephus saw it all. And after that, as I said, Josephus was kept there by the new dynasty, which we call the Flavian dynasty, because Flavius was one of Vespasian's names. And he received citizenship, Roman citizenship, in the name Titus Flavius Josephus. And he lived out the remainder of his life in Rome, at the center of the empire, the belly of the beast, writing about this tragedy and writing about the history and future of his people. We're not sure when he died, but he seems to have lived at least till the year 94, 95 CE, perhaps a few years later. So he's contemporary with the writers of the New Testament. We talk about what's going on in Christianity this time. He was a contemporary of most of them. In Rome, the thing we know about him most is that he became a writer. He gave us 4 major literary works. Well, 3 actually. One was his own biography, which he attached as an appendix to his great work. The first thing he wrote is what he calls the Jewish War. The Jewish War was his account of why this happened, how things came to this end, and all along defended at least the worthiness of the Jews as opponents against detractors who were throwing about anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic slurs against his people. So it's from this book, The Jewish War, that we get the only first-hand account of this monumental event that would affect history ever after. Following the Jewish War, much later, he went on to produce his magnum opus, his great work. Have you ever seen Mel Brooks' History of the World, his movie, The History of the World? Well, this is sort of Josephus' History of the World according to Josephus. It's called the Jewish Antiquities. Antiquities meaning the study of the past, or the things of the past, the ancient things. And his goal was to give a broader, he sort of wrote the Jewish war in the urgency of the moment to immediately rebut attacks against his people. Now he steps back, he gets a broader perspective. He wants to tell the history of the world, starting from Genesis up until the beginning of the Jewish world. He doesn't have to retell that because he has the Jewish war. So basically, from creation to the year 66 CE. That's the Jewish antiquities. It's the only connected interpretation of the Bible that we have at this point by any one individual. We have a systematic interpretation of the Jewish scriptures, and then we get everything in between that and Josephus' own lifetime, in which he uses a number of other sources, some of which would be lost to us if they were not used to produce this great history. He uses a number of sources to do this, but his basic message, one of his basic messages, is actually a message to a Roman audience. Now he's writing in Rome. His primary audience is a Roman audience and Roman aristocrats. One of his goals is to show Roman aristocrats that Jewish aristocrats like him are basically, they share the same core values. They share the same, there is no clash of civilizations between you and us. There's a clash between the aristocracy and the mob. We have that problem too, just like you do. But us and you, if you read our history with sympathetic eyes, you'll see that our values are essentially the same. We can empathize with one another. And so Josephus tells the story of his people, the story of Israel, the story of the Exodus, the story of the monarchies, right, the Jewish monarchies during the period of Israel's history, the story of his own ancestors, the Maccabees, and what happened after their rule was terminated by the Romans, and the valiant efforts of the Jewish nobility to keep the peace. There's like 3 books of the Antiquities that are devoted exclusively to the rule of Herod the Great, that ruler that sort of came between the time of the 1st century CE and the end of Maccabean rule. And if you've ever read the Gospels in the New Testament, you know how bad a reputation Herod has. Well, Josephus gives him a pretty bad rap too. And he seems to have used as his source the history of Herod's own court historian. And we're not sure how much he has sort of cast that in a negative light. We don't have an independent history of Herod from his own perspective, but we have Josephus using that history to craft the image of a tyrant. There's a disproportionate amount of space presenting Herod the Great, the king, as a tyrant. Now, think of Roman history and Roman historians. Have anyone ever seen I, Claudius, the TV series, or read the famous book by Robert Graves? I, Claudius is based on the writings of Roman aristocrats, which see an incompatibility between the tyranny of monarchy and the freedom of an aristocracy governing people. Right? And in the same way, Josephus tries to present monarchy as the enemy of freedom. So Herod is presented in the worst light, and it's always the Jewish aristocracy, the priests, who come out on top. In fact, in his other major work, after these two, the Jewish War and the Antiquities, in a work called Against Appian, which is his sort of refutation of anti-Semitism in a systematic way. He took on all the anti-Semitic ranters of the day and attempted to refute their negative and false views of Jews and Judaism. At the end of this work, he says, let's talk about the Jewish constitution, the constitution of the Jewish state. And let's compare it with other constitutions of the ancient world, and let's see which is better. And in doing this, he's actually doing a very common pastime for Greek philosophers, all the way from Plato, which is to compare different modes of political life, different forms of political organization, debate them and discuss which is the best. It's something not foreign to us during election year. Basically, the rhetoric of candidates is always about what is the best way of understanding and implementing the Constitution, the best way of interpreting our Constitution, right? So this is what philosophers did, and Josephus presents himself as a competent Jewish philosopher to examine all the possible ways of organizing human life. Moses, he says, is the greatest philosopher and greatest political philosopher of all time. The Greek constitutions, some of them were pretty good, especially the Spartan constitution. But ours is superior. And so he gives this map of the constitution of Moses the lawgiver. That's, by the way, probably a good reason for why the Jews, before Josephus, but the Jews of the first couple centuries BC, that's why when they began to speak Greek under the rule of Greeks, and they wanted to explain and present the Torah to a Greek audience and to themselves, they translated Torah, which in Hebrew means instruction, they translated into the Greek word nomos, which is a Greek word that means a number of things, but fundamentally has to do with the way a Greek city-state organizes its collective communal life. The nomos are the customs, the laws, the totality of tradition that defines a people. So they say, this is our nomos. And in English we translate it law, rather narrowly. But the nomos always needs, in the Greek world, a lawgiver. And so that's how Moses becomes transformed from a glorified secretary, which is what he is in the Old Testament, in the Bible, who simply hears what God says and dictates it, more or less. The book of Deuteronomy, for example. From that to a much more active participant, actually a crafter of the legislation of what we think of as the first 5 books of the Bible. So Moses becomes the lawgiver, the nomothetes in Greek. And that's where we get this notion of the Jews having a constitution like everyone else. Well, Josephus says Moses was the greatest lawgiver, and therefore our political constitution, our way of life, is the best of all. Now, he didn't mean that in a sort of ethnocentric, xenophobic way, because it's part of aristocratic life, part of the aristocratic intellectual life, that you debate these things. So he sort of said, this is how I would present it. And when he said, what kind of name, what classification would we give to our Constitution? Because Plato liked to classify constitutions. And all other Greek historians loved to classify constitutions as democratic, aristocratic, monarchic, all sorts of different terminologies. Josephus says, well, the best way you can translate and categorize our Constitution is by the term, and he actually has to coin a new term for this. This term, which we actually have in our language, comes from Josephus' own hand, from his own mind. He says, if I had to classify us, I would coin a new term and say we are a theocratia, a theocracy. And what do you mean by that? He says that's because we allow ourselves, our Constitution, to be shaped by God himself. Now that might seem a no-brainer because we live in a Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition which says that God is supreme and God legislates, in a sense, the best form of human life. We have canon law, we have rabbinic halakha, we have Islamic Sharia, all these different ways of codifying life. They're understood to at least somehow derive from divine precepts. But in the ancient pagan world, that was not the assumption. The assumption was that religion was basically about sacrifice and placating the gods. That's an oversimplification by all accounts. But they wouldn't think of political constitution as a religious issue, not something that is governed by the gods in any direct way. It's human beings who figure out. So Josephus says, God himself, in a sense, with Moses' help, dictates the perfect mode of human life. And we call that theocracy. But he says, what that means in practice, in human terms, it's a society ruled by priests. That's why we're spirited. So, but he says, the priests are the aristocracy. We are like you, Roman aristocrats. And we have the same problems that you have in your history, with tyrants, or with the mobs trying to overcome you. And so he casts his own history in terms of this aristocratic way of looking at things. But at the same time, he is opening up a very interesting interpretation of Jewish tradition that uses Greek and Roman political concepts and cultural concepts to explain to another audience what Jewish culture and tradition are. In other words, he is asserting that Judaism is not a narrowly xenophobic religion and way of life. It is something that is translatable and understandable, and even something that attracts non-Jews to it by its greatness. So he presents a very positive view at a time where most of the messages were very negative. So that's kind of an outline of what he wrote, what he saw, and how he responded to what he saw, and why, therefore, he is so important for us for understanding. And do I have some time? I do have some time before the hour is up. I'm going to go a little over the hour, and then we'll have time for questions and comments. Why is Josephus, beyond telling us the history that we wouldn't otherwise have, why is Josephus important for understanding Judaism, later rabbinic Judaism? And why is he important for understanding Christianity? He's important for understanding later Judaism for a couple reasons. First of all, his portrayal of history, of the Jewish past, anticipates in many of its stories, many of its assumptions, the views of the later rabbis who would go on to codify the Mishnah in the 2nd century CE, the Talmud much later. He anticipates some of these stories and ways of interpreting Torah that we find in the later rabbis. It doesn't mean that he's a proto-rabbi. It simply means that he is a witness to the diversity of Judaism in the 1st century CE. And that we see that these traditions of the rabbis indeed were very widespread. When he tells the story of the Bible, he claims to be recording these events exactly, without any deviation from the written text of Scripture. And yet he throws in there all sorts of stories that aren't in the Bible, because they're part of Jewish tradition at this time. So from a Catholic perspective, Catholics should be able to understand this, because Catholics understand their own faith in terms of written Scripture and oral tradition, as both together shaping the consciousness of believers, and the same was true for Judaism. Josephus bears witness to this growing, emergent consciousness of tradition and how it is used to interpret Scripture. Another important thing that Josephus reveals about Judaism in his day is an emerging concept of a scriptural canon. That is to say, a set list of writings that is considered to be specially sacred and specially authoritative. That canon, that list of writings, is actually different in concept from the Christian understanding of the canon of the Old Testament plus the New Testament. Christians actually have a very different understanding of how Scripture functions as a canon than we have in Judaism. In Judaism, if I may simplify, in the later Judaism of the rabbis, the canon, the authoritative Scripture, are the first 5 books of the Bible. The Torah. The Torah is the authoritative source from which everything else, around which everything else gravitates. The Jewish lectionary cycle, the scriptures that are read in the synagogue, are the scriptures of the Torah. Right? When you engage in exegesis, the interpretation of Scripture, you begin with the Torah, and you use the prophets and the writings, the other parts of the Old Testament, to make sense of it, or to support what it says, but you don't use those as an independent authority. This is exactly Josephus' view. For him, the Torah is, again, the political constitution. It is what makes Jews Jewish. Everything else, he says, is inspired, authentic, trustworthy history, religious examples of religious devotion, authentic religious devotion, those who like the Psalms, and authentic and trustworthy advice for living, which would be like the wisdom literature like Proverbs. But he says, those don't define us. Those don't dictate how we live our lives. It's the Torah that does this. And so his understanding of the canon, again, anticipates the late rabbinic understanding. So in that way, he's very significant for Judaism. There's other ways too, but I'll leave it at that. What about for Christians, for Christianity? He's mostly significant for understanding the New Testament. I've already mentioned the event that he narrates is an important event for the New Testament. If we didn't have the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in the year 70 CE, I would argue we wouldn't have the Gospels, or at least we wouldn't have them in the form that we have them. Prior to the year 70, which is to say the writings of Paul, you have no concern for relating the interpretation of Jesus' life and death and resurrection to the temple. There's no indication that that is part of Paul's understanding of Jesus. It's only with the Gospels, the written Gospels, which are all post-70 documents, that you suddenly have written accounts of Jesus' life that explicitly relate him to not only the geography of Palestine, but also the temple, and explicitly incorporate and interpret the theme of the temple's destruction. Like Josephus, the evangelists had to come to terms with the meaning of this catastrophe. Their response was rather different from Josephus's, but having Josephus to compare with the Gospels allows us to see what they're doing. That's one reason it's important for understanding the New Testament. There's also a lot of stuff that happens in the Gospels, in the stories of Jesus, that we wouldn't understand without Josephus. For example, Jesus the exorcist. Right, we have people challenging Jesus about the source of his exorcistic power, arguing that it comes from a demonic source, not a divine source. Well, and then Jesus says, well, what about your exorcists? Where did they get their power? Well, what is the meaning of this debate? Well, actually, Josephus informs us that there was a tradition of Jewish exorcism that went all the way back to King Solomon, whom God gave the power, namely the right formulas, to cast out demons. And in fact, in Josephus' own day, there were Jewish exorcists, he says, who were quite effective. And the reason why they were effective is because they invoked the name of Solomon when they cast out unclean spirits. They invoked the power of Solomon's name. Jesus didn't do that. Maybe that was the reason why his enemies were able to sort of say, he doesn't do it the way that we know it is the authoritative way to do it. There must be something wrong with it. And it also explains his reply. So Josephus helps illuminate a passage from the Gospels. Without Josephus, we wouldn't realize that there's something historically suspicious about St. Luke's account of Jesus' birth. In Luke's Gospel, Jesus is born in relationship to a Roman census. Right? Joseph and Mary go to Bethlehem because they have to go register themselves for a census that Caesar Augustus mandates for the entire world. Well, we actually know about this census in the writings of Josephus. It took place in the year 6 AD, and it was instituted by the same person we hear about in the Gospels. Unfortunately, it's 6 years too late, isn't it? Right? Jesus is born, actually it's 10 years too late. Jesus was born in the time of Herod the Great, which both evangelists attest. Herod the Great died in 4 BCE. So how could he also have been born 10 years later? He can't. It's either one or the other or neither. Right? Well, Josephus exposes that historical problem. It also raises the question, why would an author like Luke intentionally want to associate Jesus with this later event, especially if he wasn't born then? What was his theological intent to do this? We couldn't even ask those questions without Josephus. So there's a lot of things, and the list could go on. The most interesting, important thing, though, is that it's in Josephus' Jewish Antiquities, it's the only non-Christian witness to the existence of Jesus as a historical person. In Josephus' Antiquities, book 20, I believe, we have what's called the Testimonium Flavianum, the testimony of Flavius Josephus to the existence of Jesus as a Jewish contemporary of the 1st century CE. The passage is almost certainly doctored up by a Christian apologist wanting Josephus to be a kind of crypto-Christian. But if you strip away all the Christian advertisement, you still come down to a place where Josephus probably recognizes that Jesus, who was not a contemporary of him but lived right before him, it says he was a good man who was executed under Pontius Pilate. So we have external attestation for the life and death of Jesus from Josephus. Josephus also mentions that Jesus' brother James was executed by a later Jewish leader who was contemporary with Josephus. So we kind of hear snippets about characters from the New Testament which we wouldn't know about for Josephus. And the list goes on and on. But I think I'll stop there because we're just at a little past 8 o'clock. So with all that, Josephus' life, his writings, his significance, are there any questions, things you'd be interested to know about Josephus we I haven't talked about, or questions about things that I have said, or other comments or observations? Yes, sir?
One of the most authentic historic documents of Josephus, how far back can we go to authentic documentation of his actual
question is, how far back do the authentic writings of Josephus go? And by that, you mean how far back to the manuscripts that we have of him go? Well, they're all medieval. They're all medieval. I mean, just like with the Bible, they're all medieval manuscripts. Most of them are in the original Greek, which he wrote. A section of one of his works is only extant in Latin. So we have it in Latin and Greek, and also in Slavonic, too, in a couple of cases. So we have a variety of languages that attest to them. But they're all medieval. It's nothing like the Dead Sea Scrolls, where we actually have contemporary manuscripts. When you raise the question of authenticity, well, there's a lot of questions about comparing the Slavonic version of Josephus' Jewish war with the Greek version, and which one has one of them represented a different version of it, which was doctored up by Josephus later. So there are debates about which of them is more authentic on certain passages, but we really can't go much farther than that. We have a variety of manuscripts that attest to it. Other questions or thoughts or comments? Yes, ma'am.
That, the Jewish antiquities, I mean, how many volumes is this?
How many volumes is the Jewish Antiquities? It's 20 volumes. It's there's a genre of ancient history writing called universal history, and unfortunately almost none of them are still extant. There are a few that are almost complete among Greek and Roman authors. Almost all Greek authors, like Diodorus of Sicily, wrote this huge 40-volume history of the world, most of which, or at least about half of which, survives. But Josephus is basically a complete surviving work. We rarely have an ancient author for whom so many complete works survive, and works that are that big. When I say this big, I mean if you look at a translation of the Antiquities, it's about this thick. In the little Loeb Classical Library editions, it's about this wide. The only Jewish writer who vies with him for volume is Philo of Alexandria, who was a Jewish philosopher also from the first century, who has about this many writings. So Josephus and Philo are our two most prolific writers in Jewish antiquity. Yeah. But that's how many volumes? 20.
Dr. Seeman, I know that Josephus' work is very significant in terms of his actually seeing or perceiving what went on. Do we have other writings of other people of the period of other things? Why was his the only thing that we had that recorded the wars?
Okay, so the question is, we obviously have Josephus' importance as an eyewitness. Why is he the only surviving? Were there others? Yes, there were rival accounts of what happened. One of them was written by a Jewish aristocrat from the town of Tiberias, which is the capital of Galilee. He was an adversary of Josephus during the period of his generalship, and apparently wrote a rival version which made Josephus look bad. One of the reasons why we don't have his work, probably, Justus of Tiberias is his name, is because Josephus received imperial patronage and imperial. We can't really say, it's not like he got an imprimatur from the emperor. It's not like that, but he had enough prestige in his own day, among his own reading public, that his writings were preserved for that reason. But they were preserved actually ultimately because of the church. Josephus' writings were neither read nor known about after the first century by any Jewish community, as far as we know. There was some evidence during the Middle Ages of some cognizance of them, but generally Jews steered clear of them because they were embraced immediately by the emerging Christian church. This was because the Christians wanted a connected history of the period that would somehow allow them to situate them within the whole, as they would say, the history of salvation, which the Old Testament only reaches about the 6th century or 5th century with Ezra and Nehemiah BCE. So Christians wanted to find out how they could connect that with their New Testament. Josephus was the answer, and since Josephus mentioned Jesus, all the better, right? So the two reasons are that Josephus had clout in Rome, which privileged his version of events, and obviously the Romans weren't the establishment was not threatened by his works, because he also praised the emperor. He wasn't a crony by any means, but he certainly could be, again, identified with by the Roman aristocracy as a good guy. And then the Christian church embraced his writings just like they embraced and preserved Philo's writings, just like they embraced and preserved so many Hellenistic Jewish writings that have only been preserved in Christianity and only recently have, in a sense, been rediscovered, recently as in the last 2 or 3 centuries, rediscovered and embraced as significant for understanding the history of Judaism. So those are the 2 reasons why his work is survivable, not others, at least not in their totality. Yes, sir. Is there any continuity between sort of Josephus's views, his understanding of history and so on, with the current state of Israel? I can't speak to that directly. Maybe the rabbi can tell me about that, tell us all about that. But one thing that I can say very, very clearly is that without Josephus, the modern ruins of Masada would not hold the significance they do for the modern state of Israel. Masada is a desert fortress built by the Maccabees, Josephus' ancestors, which was a stronghold of resistance during the first revolt against Rome. And in fact, it survived as a stronghold 3 years after the destruction of the temple. And Josephus actually uses its downfall as sort of the climax of his Jewish war. This finally is where it all ends, on the shores of a Dead Sea, right? Literally. And if you've seen sort of the modern miniseries Masada, it's sort of this whole thing is dramatized. But Josephus dramatizes, and he makes the Jewish defenders kind of sort of noble, tragic, noble heroes, right? Who are asserting their right to self-determination, but also acknowledging defeat, historical defeat. Now, throughout Jewish history, Masada had 0 theological or historical significance. It's not mentioned by the rabbis. It's only with the birth of the state of Israel when suddenly a narrative of Jewish national self-determination becomes very significant on the site, on the spot. And so, and maybe Rabbi Spitzer can elaborate on this, I don't know how long, but this is where all Israeli soldiers go to swear in, right, to swear to serve. So at the last place where the Jews were defeated in their homeland, not the last, because there was a late revolt, but it's a symbol of Jewish resistance. It was recreated through the writings of Josephus as a symbol of the Jewish state. Would that be a fair way of describing it, or is there more you could say?
Well, I think it's a fair way. I think there's more that can be said. Just briefly, well, probably a lot more, but just briefly, recognize that when Masada was rediscovered by the founders of the state, of the the Jewish state, the situation of the Jews was one of being essentially pacifists. You know, we were the poor guys. We studied. We didn't have arms. We didn't have weapons. People pushed us around and killed us. So as they looked back in history and they saw this group of Jews that took control of their destiny, even when that destiny was the end of their lives, martyrdom, if you will, it became very, very powerful. In fact, the military now says, Masada shenit lo tipol, Masada shall not fall a second time, meaning the Jewish state shall not fall a second time. There was a problem, however, in terms of the more secular view of Jews taking control of their history and the Orthodox Jews of the time. Because we normally talk about the Jews on Masada committing suicide. And suicide is a terrible, terrible sin in Jewish life. If in fact the human being is in God's image, then suicide, the willful destruction of that image, is the greatest sin there could be. But Josephus helps us with it, with that speech of Eliezer ben Yair, the supposed zealot leader on the top of Masada, who says to them, I've got a plan for you. Every man will go home to his house and kill his wife and children. That would be murder, not suicide. And then we'll cast lots, and 10 of you will kill all the men that are left. Well, that wouldn't be suicide. that's murder. And then one person would kill the other 9, and he would fall on his sword. So only one of the 1,000 people supposedly on Masada was a sinner. So all of this came into play, but in early Israeli history and in pre-Israeli history, that image of Jews finally not going to the gas chambers like sheep, but rather taking control of their destiny becomes a very powerful symbol.
I'll say one more thing about that. Remember that Josephus is writing this narrative of the fall of Masada to a Roman audience. Now, suicide in Roman aristocratic tradition is, especially when the choice is between freedom and slavery, suicide is a noble response, a noble death. And so, again, we have to bear in mind, now Josephus says that 2 women survived somehow to tell the story, but it's very likely that that is a literary device, and that this whole speech is Josephus' own invention. I mean, according to him, all the Jews were dead when the Romans got there, so who would have heard the speech? They didn't write it down. So this is really Josephus, the aristocrat, giving a noble end to what might have been a much more negative, grim reality. But for that very reason, there clearly was intention to communicate a sense of Jewish nobility to a Roman audience. So there's a cultural and intercultural conversation going on in that very narrative. It's probably, for all we know, if there was a speech, it might have been very different. We simply don't know. And again, because Josephus is our only narrative, he controls the way we see things. He controls our only avenue into this. Now, that's almost not true in one case, and that is and here we're going back sort of to during the Revolt, the heyday of the Revolt, from 66 to 70. During those 4 years, the Jewish government, the rebel government, which Josephus was a part originally, they minted coinage. They minted independent coinage. And that's how you declare your independence. And we've recovered many of these coins of the Revolt. And if you look at what was the imagery on the coins, first of all, they were all written in Paleo-Hebrew letters, which is to say the traditional alphabet of Jewish tradition, before Aramaic was used. And so it was a declaration of an affirmation of tradition. But what did those letters say? They said, for the redemption of Zion. For the redemption of Zion. And what does that mean? Or for the freedom of Zion. Redemption means we are in a state of slavery and we are buying Zion back from a state of slavery. That's biblical imagery. So the rebels themselves, passe Josephus' negative, retrospective negative description, they saw themselves in the tradition of the great prophecy. That, this is the time of the redemption of Zion is at hand. And again, there's evidence of this on the Christian side. If you look at Luke's Gospel, what do all, in the musical part of Luke's Gospel, which is the first couple chapters about the prophecy of the birth of the Messiah, what are they all looking for? They're looking for the redemption of Jerusalem from its enemies. Now, most biblical scholars that I've read try to spiritualize this, but it just doesn't work that way. The language is of political redemption, and the only enemies that are political enemies from the viewpoints of the rebels are the Romans. And remember, what is the question they asked Jesus at the end? His disciples asked him, are you going to restore political sovereignty now that you're the Messiah? So Luke's Gospel is very much in tune and sensitive to this understanding of the revolt. And that's what we know from, that's the only text we have of what the rebels in situ were saying.
But
we are reclaiming that tradition for ourselves.
Are you suggesting that the coins and that attitude was not apocalyptic, but was political only?
Okay, so the question is the attitude of those slogans, right? The redemption of Zion, was it political rather than apocalyptic? And by apocalyptic, I assume we're talking it's to be accomplished by God rather than humans?
The fulfillment of God's plan.
The fulfillment of God's plan. I would suggest, but it's both. It's very likely that the rebels understood through their own actions they were bringing about God's will. God had given them an opportunity now to realize this biblical promise of the redemption of Israel from slavery. There's a famous passage in the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah, where from the Old Testament, where Ezra and Nehemiah, these servants of the Persian Empire, say, we are still slaves. We are enslaved. And, the Persians have been merciful to us thanks to God influencing them. They've allowed us to rebuild our temple to worship our God in freedom. But we are in slavery still. So even there, in that very accommodationist document where empire is accommodated, that hope for a future redemption is still there. And many Jews would not distinguish between the Dead Sea sect, where we sort of wait out in the desert for God to nuke the Romans, versus a political solution, which is take matters into our hands. Many Jews at the time apparently saw themselves as embodying the divine will. So that's I think it's a complicated question there.
Do my students have questions?
Well, here's a question for the students. How about this? So what have you been learning in this class of what's the rabbi been talking about? What have you been reading about?
We've been reading 2 separate books.
2 separate books. Right? I know what they are.
Yeah.
You may tell us all what have you been reading in those books? What have they been talking
One
about?
of them accounts, we just started reading the second one. It accounts a lot for the history. Right now it's describing what exactly, the history, like the dates that you gave. It introduced Josephus, it introduced the clash of 2 cultures. And the next section that we're starting through now, it goes into more of history of this is Rome then, this is Jerusalem then, without the clash.
Right.
And the first one was more of,
So what I've been talking about tonight is sort of overlapping with some of the things you've been doing.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah. Well, and as I said, I think Josephus is kind of cool because he's the one who invented, in order to refute this notion of there being an irreconcilable clash of civilizations. I mean, we get this today in modern Islamophobia, right? There's sort of, there's negative things going on perpetrated by Muslims, and so there are sort of cultural warriors in the West saying, there's an incompatible gulf between us and them. And then there are many Muslim responses to this where saying, no, that is not the tradition. This is the tradition. So Josephus is very much doing the same thing in a first century context where it was the Jews who were being dumped on because of violent actions that were taking place. And Josephus is trying both to not explain away, but to explain the actions of his countrymen in at least a sympathetic light, and also explaining it in a way that connects with the values of the other side. So again, he is very much in the same kind of cultural situation that many Muslims, especially American Muslims, are in today. So there's maybe a way you can even compare with different religions. There are certain times in history where there are radically different assessments, right, of a religious tradition from insiders and outsiders, and even within a tradition. And you have various people who come up to the plate and attempt to set the matter straight, or even to monopolize and authorize their version of things, which is what Josephus does. So there's what would be other examples of this, of a cultural, a perception, or at least an alleged clash of values, or a clash of irreconcilable interests, public interests, national interests, where religion is sort of cited as a component, or religious tradition is cited as a problem or a solution. What other things that are going on today can you think of that sort of fits that dynamic? Today, or maybe a little while ago, in the recent past, or throughout history. Well, in our own country, 50 years ago, it was Catholics who were the irreconcilable other. Right? The book about why you can't have a Catholic president, because if you do, you're basically imposing a medieval tyranny, right, upon a free nation. That same rhetoric of freedom versus slavery, and political, a form of constitution versus an antithetical form of constitution. That was true of the recent Catholic past too. And again, you had defenders and aggressors in that conflict with different viewpoints being expressed. It seems to be over now, at least at the national level. And now there's Muslims and there's Mormons, right? you have Mormons, too, in the current election as being, they're the irreconcilable other, at least for certain constituencies within Christian America. And you have Mormons having to defend themselves. We're all Americans. Our values are the same as everyone's values. So there's many groups in the present as well as certainly in the past that you would exemplify that same kind of conflict. And I think that maybe that's something to think about as you're doing this course. Is you're not just studying ancient history. Right? You're not just studying Judaism. You're studying a phenomenon of human history, right? Which is in the present, in the past, and certainly will probably continue in the future. The cycle never stops. We hope it would at some point. But as we say, that stopping of that cycle, that's a messianic reality.
Yeah.
When the Messiah comes or comes back, depending on which version we're talking about, then all of the cycles will cease. We're not there yet, are we? Right? We're in process. But hopefully we're learning. We can learn from history in this way. We can learn how to correct at least inadequate assessments of things and gain a broader perspective that's a bit more sympathetic and empathetic to all sides when you have a conflict.
In the first text that we used in our course by James Carroll, who wrote Constantine's Sword, he will go on to suggest, aside from his own anthropology, that we have within us this deep-seated violence which we use our faith to overcome by sacrifice, war. But he will suggest to us things like the evangelical movement is a way of othering other people. And he looks at American history so that we can see that the United States is the city on the hill and the rest of these folks and so on and so forth. That's a very interesting question and issue that you brought up about how the structure between Rome and Jerusalem, how what Josephus is trying to do is a structure that we in fact continue to use today and malicious today.
To draw on that, so the comment was about perhaps as a universal human pattern or in specific groups, there is a need to define oneself or one's group by creating an other. It doesn't necessarily mean a clash of civilizations, but it's the other guys, the other people who are different from us and who we are not. Right? Clearly there's been a structure within Christianity of that where the Jews are the other. Historically, that's anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, which most people have gotten over or are working together over now. As I've suggested, Islamophobia is an emerging version of that pattern. But you can even look at Josephus as an example of a Jew who is creating others. Right? I've already emphasized that he doesn't want to see the Romans as the negative other. Right? Rather, he says there are good Romans and bad Romans. Just as there are good Jews and bad Jews. But he does, in fact, have to deal and confront a biblical past, a biblical narrative, where there are certain parts of the Bible where there is a clear, us versus them. Right? In my Old Testament class, we've been reading the Exodus story, where there is indeed an us and a them. It's Israel is, God makes a distinction between Israel and Egypt, and Egypt represents all that is bad. And in the book of Leviticus, right, which we are reading this week, you are not to be like the Egyptians or like the Canaanites, who do all sorts of evil things, like have sex with animals and things like that. We are the good guys, they are the bad guys. Well, of course, Josephus has to refute negative images of Jews, but he also does so by engaging in a little othering on his own. But he has to deal with these places in the Bible where there are perhaps negative views of foreigners altogether, and he actually massages some of those texts to mean exactly the opposite. Like there is a hostile tradition about Israel and the nations, and he simply reinterprets it. There's a very famous passage in the book of Numbers where Balaam, the non-Israelite, blesses Israel 3 times and speaks about Israel's glorious future. Josephus interprets that future to be not the history of a sovereign state, which appears to be what Balaam is doing, anticipating the Israelite monarchy. But rather, he says Balaam is anticipating the diaspora, the scattering of Judaism and Jews throughout the world as a blessing to all nations. So Josephus takes what is in some biblical traditions a negative, right, the separation of people from their homeland, and he's saying this is actually a positive blessing to the world. So here he's taking possibly us versus them text of the Bible, and he's reinterpreting it in a constructive light, constructive for his own situation. And so that's another thing you do when you deal with this phenomenon, is you try to deal with problematic texts within your own tradition that seem to become fuel either for fanatics within or detractors from that. You have to redefine the discourse, the whole issue of who we are and how we relate to others. So we see that in Josephus too. We see it in multiple volumes of his history of the Jews, and against Appian. He presents the Egyptians mainly as the worst sort of people, and they're his of it for the most part. Sometimes the Greeks come off as kind of bad, but the Romans, they share our virtues.
Friends, any other
observations? How are we doing on time?
I think that we are at the point at which we say to people, you may leave with impunity.
But I'm happy to talk or to answer questions or converse.
First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Seeman very much for his presentation.